Once again, shalom. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dan Libenson. Daniel Libenson is an ACRE board member. We first met him at the 2014 ACRE conference, which featured a discussion of a series of articles in Chaim Herring's book, Keeping Faith in Rabbis, a community conversation on rabbinical education. Dan, along with Barak Richmond, the co-author of their article, Right Skilling, Rabbis and the Rabbinic Role in the New Century, participated in a panel discussion that also included Michael Marmer of HUC. In real life, Dan is the founder and president of the Institute for the New Jewish Future. The Institute for the New Jewish Future is a hub for ideas, education, and action dedicated to accelerating bold innovation in Jewish life. Dan is also co-host of the Institute's project, one of the Institute's projects, the Judaism Unbound podcast. They are already up to close to 6,000 listeners a month. Dan's topic today is how synagogues can survive disruption, learning from the story of Dayton Hudson and Target. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Libenson.
I have some slides, but we were having a technical issue sharing them. I don't have a lot of slides, so hopefully it should be okay. But please send in, questions if you have them, and if you need clarifications, I will do my best to clarify, to describe slides visually. So I was talking to my dad this morning. He's a rabbi, about that I was going to be talking to a group of rabbis, and how would I make them feel comfortable. And he said, you should start by saying, "Please be seated." So it's a little weird to be telling a joke that I can't tell if there's any reaction to, but I actually think that that's part of the situation that we're looking at, where fundamentally we're existing in a new Jewish world that in different ways functions differently from the way that the old Jewish world functioned. And part of our struggle is to figure out how to adjust to that. By way of introduction, just a little bit beyond what Steve said, I want to just say that Lex Rofus, who I think is on this call, or on this webinar too, and I are hosting a podcast called Judaism Unbound. So I'm going to go back to the basic approach here. I'm trying to look at whether there's anything that synagogues can do to address the fact that a lot of people are not connecting to synagogues anymore. And in order to do that, I am trying to start with an analogy to landline telephones, where I want to sort of put out there, as an analogy, that I think that there are some important similarities to the way that we all think about landline telephones and the synagogue today. Specifically, I think that very few people actually need to have a landline in their house for reasons that only a landline can accomplish the telephone things that they're trying to do. The only people that I think that basically need a landline in their house in general are people who don't have strong cell phone service in their house, and people who, like me, are podcasters or for some other reason need to have a very high quality phone conversation that is reliable on a regular basis, or really even ever, because they're recording the calls, or otherwise really needing to make sure that there's never a dropout, that there's never a problem with the line. Otherwise, I think that there are people who may like to have a landline. I think there's a lot of people who essentially have a landline as a form of an insurance policy, that in their minds they're saying, well, there may be a time at some point in the future where I have to call 911, and I'm going to be able to make it to my landline, right? Sometimes even a cell phone is better for calling 911 because you have it with you all the time, but maybe I'll be able to make it to my cell phone, to my landline, and 911 works better with a landline, and so the police or ambulance is going to know how to get to my house exactly, and I won't, even if I'm not able to say where it is, they'll still be able to get to my house quickly. And sure, that's kind of this sort of insurance policy. You're probably never going to use the landline that way, but because you might at some point, you're essentially willing to do what amounts to essentially spending about $1,000 a year in order to have that insurance policy. But I think there's a second reason that a lot of people, particularly older people, and we're not talking about super older people, we're talking about people Gen X, let's say, and older, have a landline in their houses, because I think they have a deeply embodied sense that they can't even tell you exactly why. If you ask them, they'll try to sort of come up with some reasons, but fundamentally the reason why they have a landline in their house is because it just feels wrong to them not to have a landline. There's something just sort of deeply embodied. I see, by the way, that people are saying the sound is going in and out, and Steve, unless there's something you can do, there's really nothing that I know what I can do about it. So unless you tell me otherwise, I'm going to keep talking and hope for the best. So the bottom line is that I think that so that I think that there are a lot of older people who feel a deeply embodied sense that they should have a landline, but can't necessarily tell you why. For me, this is essentially similar to, I think, a lot of synagogue membership. I think that in the past, many people were members of synagogues not because they were particularly looking for the religious life that the synagogue saw sort of as the focus of its mission, or that the rabbi or perhaps some of the more observant members would see as sort of the focus of the synagogue's mission. They were actually looking for other things that they could have and that they couldn't really have in other parts of their lives. We're talking about various communities, social connections, even business connections. And a wide variety of other kinds of goods that they were really not able to have available to them elsewhere in America, because Jews were seen as others and were essentially not invited to participate in those experiences elsewhere in America. So they essentially could get it from the synagogue. But I think that as American Jews began to be more and more accepted as members of, let's say, white America, that they were able to obtain those things elsewhere in American society, and to the extent that they weren't looking for the core sort of religious functions of the synagogue as their primary reason for joining the synagogue, essentially those are the people that are analogous to those who are looking to do things on their phones that are not the really high-end needs of using a landline like a podcaster like me would have. So I think that it's sort of understood that a lot of people, it's not so much that American Jews have become less interested in the religious function of the synagogue. I think it's a little bit of that, but I think it's largely that American Jews were never primarily connecting to the synagogue because of its religious function, and were more connecting to the synagogue somewhat in spite of its religious function, and largely looking for various other kinds of goods from the experience that they can now get elsewhere. So at that point, I want to bring in Clayton Christensen's thinking, because it essentially, I think it's very useful to look at this. Christensen basically looks at products, and he was working largely in the for-profit world, but it's my feeling that these ideas apply just as much to the not-for-profit or religious world, etc. We can certainly discuss that. But Christensen basically identifies that when a product or a service or an organization overserves its customers, in other words, it's made up of a large number of goods and experiences and things that it's providing that actually most of its, quote, customers don't need or don't want, but some of them do, that essentially that organization is over-serving its customers, and if in order to provide that service that is actually more than most people want, the cost obviously has to be such, and I'm not only talking about costs in money, I'm also talking about the costs in time that's expected, for example, the length of a service, etc. If the only way to sort of provide the full package of services that organization is providing is in such a way that it's actually providing more than many of the potential participants are looking for, then eventually if they have an alternative, they'll take that alternative. so that's where I'm saying that in, let's say, the early part of the 20th century, even the middle part of the 20th century, to the extent that a lot of these sorts of experiences and things that Jews were looking for were not available outside of Jewish organizations, they were willing to pay the price in time or money or both in order to get those things. But as they became welcomed into other environments, they were no longer willing to pay that price. And I think that Christensen brings in two ideas that are particularly important to wrap our minds around, which is that that's often very hard for the kind of stalwart participants, or perhaps in this case the rabbis, to understand, because they look at the choices that the people are making, and they essentially, from their perspective, they are choosing an inferior product. And it isn't inferior. It doesn't do a lot of the things that the older product did. But that's not what those people are looking for. And again, I want to sort of put out there the possibility, that they were never actually looking for that they were always participating because of the things that they cared about, and people have pretty much always cared about the same things. And it's just now that they can get the things that they do care about without being bundled with the things that they don't care about. And I think another analogy that we could look at is the music industry and how it used to be that you could only buy the song that you wanted in an album, but then because of the digital revolution, you're able to buy songs individually more easily, and people stopped buying albums for the most part. So now that they can obtain those sort of social goods that they're looking for without the bundle of the various religious dimensions that they weren't interested in, they're no longer doing that. From their perspective, what they are obtaining is potentially, quote, good enough. And Christensen really introduces this idea of good enough, that if a person is getting something that is good enough for what they're looking for, even though it's not as good as something else, if it's good enough for them, they're actually satisfied with that. And another concept that Christensen introduces that I think is useful here is that we can think about what people are trying to accomplish in their lives by imagining that they are employers and they have a job opening, right? And they're trying to hire somebody, or in this case, an organization, to achieve a job in their lives, right? A job that they have set out. And just like a company puts out a job description and a offered salary, that that in people's lives, they're essentially saying, this is the job that I need to accomplish in my life, and this is the amount of resources. And again, I want to talk about both time and money as resources. And I think just to note that there's a book called Judaism in Transition by Carmel Chiswick, who is an economist, where she talks about Judaism sort of and the various economics of Judaism, but she's very careful and insistent to explain that economics is the study of limited resources, not only the study of money. And so time is very much a limited resource. And in fact, for people who are more economically the more wealthy a person is, the more and Jews have certainly moved into the upper middle class in general in American society. The more wealthy people are, the more they perceive their time is valuable, and so it's understandable that not only because time is always valuable, but also because Jews have migrated into the middle and upper middle class in America, that that they would be much more careful about ways in which they spend their time than they may have been in the past. So essentially, a person is putting out a job description and a budget in time or money for what they're looking for, and that anybody who is trying to sort of get some of their time or money or energy needs to sort of ask this question: is the thing that I'm offering really the job that they're trying to get done in their lives? And am I able to offer that service at a cost that they're willing and able to pay? And so, again, I think that if we misunderstand what American Jews were looking for, let's say 50 years ago, and say, they were looking for religious life, and now they're not getting that so now they're not participating in the synagogue, and they're not getting that religious life, and so we have to try to sort of connect them to religion in a new way. That may be the case, but it also may be the case that the job that they were trying to achieve in their lives was never religious life. It was, let's say, social community or even business opportunity, like I was talking about. We all know that many business connections are made in social environments, including in Jewish social environments. And so there are a variety of things that people might have been looking for, and if they can achieve those things outside of the synagogue, then they might, especially if that requires a lower cost. And when people who remain with the old thing look at that, they generally kind of look down on those choices because they correctly say, but it's not as good, right? I mean, basically, you used to have a Cadillac and now you're buying a Corolla. A Corolla is not as good as a Cadillac, so that's a bad choice. But the other person is saying, you know what, I don't need that sort of all those features that a Cadillac has. All I need to do is get from one place to another. I don't care how fancy it is, and a Corolla is cheaper, and that works better for me. So to the extent that enough people are kind of looking at things that way, that the synagogue becomes an economically non-viable entity, or is getting close to becoming an economically non-viable entity, there are really four choices, I think, of what it can do. Number one, it can close down, and we certainly see a lot of that happening in the Jewish world today. The second is that it can compete in the smaller market of Jews that are interested in synagogues. If it doesn't have enough members of its own anymore that are enough to make the synagogue a viable entity, then it can start to try to compete for members of other synagogues, and it can sort of either do that in one of two ways. One is that it can just, maybe a town used to have two Reform synagogues, and one of them sort of is better for one reason or another, is perceived as better by the synagogue-loving Jews, and so they bring in a new rabbi or something who's more charismatic or somehow more attractive, and people migrate over from one synagogue to the other, and the less successful synagogue closes, but the more successful one essentially has competed successfully for that market share and is okay for a while longer. Another variant of the competition choice is to say we're going to move up market, essentially, put that in quotations, but we're going to find ways to allow sort of a more observant community to use our facility. So, there are various liberal Jewish synagogues, for example, that have an Orthodox minyan that meets in the synagogue, for example, and that's a way of saying, well, there's another group of people that they may have an Orthodox synagogue that where they're spending a lot of money on building space and stuff that they can't afford, and we can actually provide them something that they need, and we can get some of their energy, time, and money, and keep our organization going, or sort of other ways in which, or they don't have another synagogue, but they're a very synagogue-oriented type of community that's out there that we could potentially offer something to, and that would sort of bolster our economics. And the third option is that we see a lot of as well, is to merge with another synagogue. In that way, we don't sort of have to drive anybody out of business, but we can actually just take both synagogues, merge them together. That obviously has strengths and problems, especially if those synagogues come from different denominations. That might be difficult. But essentially that consolidates all the people that are still interested in synagogue experience and consolidates them into one entity that it can eliminate a bunch of the costs, such as having two buildings, two clergy structures, etc., and keep going that way. So the fourth option is to try to attract, quote, non-consumers, right? The Jews who are not participating in synagogue life at all. There are a few different ways that might happen. The dues could be lowered, for example, or various new services could be provided. Or the services that are provided, such as the actual services, could be changed in such a way that is more attractive to people that are not participating. So, for example, the Torah service could be shortened, or the cantorial music, if that's something that doesn't connect with a lot of people, we can shift to a different kind of more singing together kind of music. The problem with a lot of those kinds of changes is essentially this is a key idea that comes out of Clayton Christensen's research, which is fundamentally that the issue is that if you try to change your product enough to appeal to the people who are not participating, you're probably going to change it too much such that your current participants are going to be unhappy. And if you really change it too much, they're going to be so unhappy that they're going to leave. And your current participants are probably the people that are paying the full dues or even making contributions, certainly of time, that go beyond any sort of requirement. And they're the people that are probably keeping your institution going now, whereas any new people that might connect, their connection is going to be relatively light at the beginning. They're probably not going to give as much money. They're not going to give as much time. And so you're essentially trading off your, quote, best customers for new customers who it'll, at best, it'll take some time to get them to a place where they're really sustaining the organization. And in the short term, that is just not a good idea. And actually, I think one of Christensen's greatest insights is that the companies that struggle with this kind of sea change are not poorly managed companies. They're actually very well managed companies, because they understand that it would be suicide to make the decision in the short term that would allow us to connect with a potential group of new customers, because we'll have to lose our old customers in doing so. So the question is there anything that can be done about this? And one of the stories that Christensen tells, and that I think is really significant in all this, is that sometimes it happens that a company that's under this kind of threat is able to weather it. And one of the greatest stories is that of the Dayton-Hudson Corporation, which, as probably most of you know, was a department store company, just like Macy's, Bloomingdale's, etc., and that was facing the same kind of situation, or an analogous situation, from the fact that there were these sort of low-end big box retailers like Walmart that were coming around and really threatening their business in various ways that we don't really have time to get into. And a lot of them just kind of kept doing what they were doing, or tried to do new things like having sales and or changing their product makeup or whatever they tried to do, but it wasn't working. Whereas what the Dayton-Hudson Corporation did was they initially acquired a small company, and they invested in it. It was called Target, and they essentially became Target's sole funders, Target's patron, let's say. They invested a lot of money in Target and gave Target whatever resources Target needed in order to exploit the market opportunity that it saw with that style of retailing. And that was very successful. Target grew and grew and grew. And Dayton-Hudson, rather than at a certain point when Target started to, if a Target would open up in the same city as a Dayton-Hudson department store, you would imagine that a lot of companies would say, okay, but you can't sell the same products as we sell, or you can't undercut us on price, or you can't advertise in certain ways. But Dayton-Hudson didn't do any of that. They essentially allowed Target to work as an independent entity that they owned but did not operate, essentially. And eventually, Target did compete with Dayton-Hudson stores in different ways. And eventually, Target became so successful that that it was much bigger than the original Dayton-Hudson stores, and they eventually changed the name of the company to the Target Corporation, and later they even sold off the remaining department stores to a different department store chain. So, and not only that, I think it's important to note that Target over time became sort of more and more high-end and design-oriented, right? I think Target didn't only sort of allow Dayton-Hudson to move into a new kind of, quote, inferior style of retailing. Target actually, at the same time, became, took a lot of the types of things that make department stores special, and in different ways added them into the Target experience, such that Target is actually a different kind of low-cost retailer than Walmart is, for example. They emphasize design, they do all kinds of things. So, and Target isn't done. I think Target will continue to evolve. And so essentially you see that they originally started kind of at the low end, and Target has kind of migrated its way up market. So I want to put out there in the time that remains, and I want to leave some time available for some questions and discussion. And I'm sorry for the technical issues that caused us to start late. But I want to put out that basic idea and then sort of suggest that a couple of things. Number one, that Christensen talks about, and it's a very important part of his theory, his research, and understanding of where companies have been successful with a target sort of strategy, that it generally requires setting up an independent business unit or an independent organization that's owned by but not operated by the older entity in order to do this successfully. So one example is Target. Another example, I think, is the IBM PC, which was the division of IBM that created the PC, was owned by IBM corporate, but which is based in New York, but it was an independent unit that was operated out of Florida and that had very little control by the corporate headquarters of IBM. And that because essentially the IBM PC was competing with other products that IBM did, and if that was if questions about how to create a personal computer were left up to the management of the larger IBM company, they would have made choices that would have ultimately not allowed them to produce a computer that really could be successful in the consumer market. So there are a variety of examples like that, but I think that as we move into the realm of synagogues, we would essentially say that I guess what I want to put out there is basically the idea that a synagogue is simply not going to be able to keep the basic functions of the synagogue, whether that's the services, the Hebrew school, whatever are the key functions of the synagogue, is simply not going to be able to change those in such a way that's going to attract a large number of unconnected Jews. They might be able to attract a number of people that are connected to other synagogues, and maybe that's a valid form of a synagogue sort of maintaining itself in the wake of disruption. That okay, so we'll consolidate in one way. But if the synagogue doesn't want to do that or can't do that, and is trying to say, how can we find a way to connect to the uninvolved people, that Christensen's theory and my experience and looking at other synagogues that are around would suggest that that's really not something that's possible. And to the extent that there are exceptions, they're probably the exceptions that prove the rule, although I'd love to discuss them. What can work is for a synagogue to create a separate entity that may be, from a corporate perspective, quote, owned by the synagogue, right? It might be part of the synagogue's 501c3, and to allow that entity to operate independently among the people who are not connecting to the synagogue, and to fully invest in the idea of what is it that those people really need in their lives, to really understand those people in a deep way, understand the jobs that they have to be done, and say, what can we create that really will allow those people to accomplish the jobs that they need to be done in their lives, with no regard whatsoever to what the synagogue is currently doing or is currently about. That doesn't mean that Judaism doesn't come in. Of course it does. But the idea is that we are going to try to connect Judaism to these people who are not participating, but that Judaism doesn't have to be defined in any way necessarily by various practices that are currently dominant in the synagogue. So what might that look like? For example, that could look like a I think that one of the phenomena that I think is interesting is the Jewish after-school programs that are popping up around the country. That, from my perspective, what those programs are fundamentally seeing is that Jewish young parents have a job to be done in their lives. Right? They are actually two jobs, in my view. One is that they are looking for childcare, and number two is that they are looking for a way of Jewishly educating or connecting their children to Judaism in a way that would be in accordance with their family's values. They are looking for both of those things. One is explicitly Jewish, one is not. I think it's interesting with a variety of these Jewish after-school programs that are popping up all over the country that they are trying to solve both of those jobs, right? They are trying to provide childcare, so they actually, many of them, if not all or most of them, they operate more days a week than a typical Hebrew school or religious school would, because they're actually not only meeting the need for religious education or Jewish education, they're meeting the need for childcare. So some of them even have 5 or 6 day a week programs, at least that's available to people. And number two is that the people actually are looking for some kind of Jewish education or Jewish experience for their kids. So if that turns out to be a widely shared need among people that are not members of any synagogue, that are not participating in any synagogue, right, the one thing that synagogue could try to do would be to sort of create an entity like that and say, okay, that's a service that we now provide for members, but the cost of membership will end up being higher than people are willing to pay because like I said earlier, the synagogue is actually over-serving them. The synagogue is bundling elements that they actually don't want and are not interested in or not willing to pay for. Whereas an organization that is merely providing that kind of Jewish enriched childcare can provide only that and can not only provide it for a lower price, because that's all they're doing, but also that is the 100% sole focus of what they're doing, and therefore the people that are participating feel like they are at the center of the organization. They are the sole focus of the organization. Their needs are precisely what is being served by the organization, and they don't have to feel like they're just sort of peripheral members of a larger organization. So the question is, could a synagogue provide that experience for those people, right? Meaning, does that have to be done by an independent startup, or could a synagogue actually create an organization like that? Could a day school, in another context, and I've written an article about this, actually create an independent entity that provides that kind of education and that kind of service? And I think that, in my mind, would be the version of the Target Dayton Hudson story in the synagogue world. And that's just one example. There are other examples that, for example, there are a few synagogues that actually operate sort of a separate organization for 20, 30-something people. It's not a outreach initiative. It's actually an independent organization that is aimed at those people, and it's not necessarily the case that the goal is ever that those people should join the synagogue. I think what's more likely to happen, or what would be the sort of target story in either of those situations, would be that if that after-school enrichment center really attracted a very committed group of parents who were getting what they needed out of it, then over time those kids would grow older and they would want to have a bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, and those might be provided through that after-school program. As they grew older, down the road, perhaps they would want to get married through that program, et cetera. The point is that entity would grow and grow over time to meet new needs like Target did, and eventually it might be that more people are participating in that other program than are participating in the sort of older main program of the synagogue. At a certain point, like Target changed the name, so like Dayton Hudson changed its name to the Target Corporation, at a certain point far in the future, the synagogue might decide, hey, we want to sort of reverse it, and we'll kind of give the main resources to that once small organization, and our once big organization will now become a constituent piece of that new organization, but we'll sort of reverse the dominance of it. And in my mind, that is a viable long-term strategy for synagogues to explore. But I think that the main point that comes out of Christensen's work is that the only way to allow that to work is for the new entity to be given sort of free rein to be that what the synagogue leadership, whether that's the rabbi or the board, really needs to do, for example, is to run interference so that the board will not try to control that organization, to allow that organization to compete. If the synagogue has a Hebrew school and you start an after-school program for the same ages, allow the two to exist together. Allow them to compete. And if it turns out that the after-school program outcompetes the synagogue Hebrew school, such that everyone's going to the after-school program, that's great. But that basic idea is, from my experience and sense of the theory, is pretty much the only viable way for a synagogue to sort of weather the storm of which fundamentally is, at least in the short term, a lack of interest by Jews in the core substance of what the synagogue provides. So, I'm going to end here just because of the time, but I think that on the one hand, I think that's sort of a tough message. On the other hand, I actually think it's also hopefully a comforting message, because there is a way to do it. It just may not be a way that thrills a lot of people. In his book, I think Good to Great, Jim Collins writes about what he calls the Stockdale paradox that comes from Admiral Jim Stockdale's experience in the Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War, where he says, that what you really need to do is face, unflinchingly face the reality of the situation that you're in, but never lose hope that never lose hope that you'll be able to overcome it and get to a better future. And so I think that what I'm trying to do here is squarely face the challenges that synagogues face, but at the same time understand that there is an approach to overcoming them, even if it's not one that people are going to be necessarily thrilled about. But in the longer term, but I do think that approach does allow in the short term for the people who do like what the synagogue is doing to continue to have that, while at the same time allowing a different entity to be created within the synagogue that fully focuses on the needs and the interests of the people that are not participating. So that's my basic framework. And Steve, whatever is the next step, let me know. And somebody put in the messages the well in Bloomfield, Michigan, West Bloomfield, Michigan, and that's exactly right. I don't know, to deep details. I don't know exactly how that's run. So, I don't want to say that they're definitely doing it right, because I don't know how much control they're trying to have, etc. But from what I've read, it does seem very much like that program of Temple Israel in Michigan is very much a sort of target program where they're running a separate program for young adults that seems to be not at all controlled by the synagogue and allowed to operate on its own.
Dan, Judah also asked a question, which I can actually put up on the screen if you like.
Sure. So the question is, would I say that denominations themselves are like the home phone, not relevant to today's generation? I mean, yes, I'm trying to think about the analogy. I would definitely say that they're not relevant to today's generation. Though part of my question is whether they were ever relevant to most people. It's something that I'm trying to sort of think through. But in my view, I just wonder whether most Jews were ever particularly interested in or even knowledgeable about what the denominations were in a philosophical sense. I think that they understood from an experiential sense that the style of service was different in one denomination or another, or that there would be perhaps some other differences. But I really think that that a lot of the denominational differences, their impact was coming in a world where I think that Jews wanted to affiliate with some synagogue, for the various social goods and embodied sense of responsibility that they used to have, and then it was a question of which one fit more with my perspective. Now that I think that people aren't thinking that way anymore. So to my mind, it's more like, do I want to get like a push button phone or do I want to get a dial phone? But once I'm not sure that I even want a landline anymore, then that's not the question that I'm asking anymore. So I think that it's something more along those lines. And so I think that once we shift to a world where we understand that telephony is going to be more in the realm of cell phones, now we're asking a different set of questions. And it's not about push button or dial anymore. It's about Apple versus Samsung or whatever that might be. And so I think that the problem with the denominations is that they have answers to a set of questions that people aren't asking anymore. So, but that doesn't mean that there aren't new questions that people are asking. I think there are, and they're not being really looked at by anyone. The other question from Chaim.
Chaim's question is here. Just to give people a heads up, I know that it's now 1:01. I'm sorry that we started late and had some problems. I imagine Dan can stay a little bit longer, and if those of you who can will, that would be great. And those who can't, we understand and we thank you and we appreciate your participation.
Yeah, thanks so much. And if anybody wants to engage me and directly, you can just send me an email at dan@nextjewishfuture.org. And I'd love to be in conversation. So Chaim's question is, do you know if Chabad has more recently been purchasing larger synagogue buildings, and if so, are they likely to face the same financial challenges that many existing congregations face? I think there's a few different questions. First of all, do I know if Chabad has recently been purchasing larger synagogues? Like, I don't really know. So I'm not sure if you're saying that you know that they are, and what do I think about that? I don't know whether they are or aren't. I know that some have been, and I think it's actually sort of a natural thing that Chaim has heard anecdotally that they are. It's interesting because I think short term, a lot of organizations, it's sort of a natural thing to do that if you're growing in the short term, then you do whatever you think you need to do in order to sustain and sort of give people in the short term what they're looking for. So I think that if a Chabad in a local community is doing particularly well today and their organizations are, their current buildings are like busting out, they don't have room for people for services or for their events or whatever, then it's natural that they're going to look for a bigger space. Now, the fallacy is if you're not looking into the future and you're saying, and are you asking the question, and does it come from a place other than faith? And again, I respect if somebody believes that faith is a good basis for making future decisions, then I respect that, and they can give that a try. It's not the basis that I would use. I would want to use a more analytical question. And so, to my mind, if an organization like Chabad is doing well in the present, and they buy a large piece of real estate that, in order to serve that present, then they're putting themselves in a position where if what they're looking at is a bubble, they're going to be in a problem when that bubble bursts. And by the way, I want to say that, I think, and I don't know, maybe this has been written elsewhere, I haven't really sort of read it or looked too hard for it, but it feels to me like there was essentially a bubble of synagogue building, of liberal Judaism synagogue building in the post-war era that came from various reasons, that there was that demand that allowed a perception to exist that a building, and we're not only talking about real estate here, we're talking about growing the number of rabbis and all sorts of other investments in Jewish infrastructure, that there seemed to be a belief that the demand that there was in the 1950s, 1960s for that was going to be permanent. And there doesn't seem to have been a real even asking of the questions that is this a bubble? And we see that often enough with the financial markets. So that sort of doesn't surprise me that thinking is out there. And I would really ask whether any success that Chabad is having today, is that merely a bubble? And I don't know if Chabad is asking themselves those questions. It's hard for me to see that long term, what Chabad is offering is going to be of interest to large enough numbers of Jews to sustain even what they had up till now, much less I would say larger buildings. We could talk about it more, but I'm dubious that Chabad represents a long-term success.
Any other questions, comments? Not hearing any and seeing Rebecca saying thank you. I want to say thank you to Dan also. I want to remind everybody about the podcast, Judaism Unbound, in which Dan talks about this and other important issues of the world, and from a perspective which perhaps not everybody is used to hearing on a regular basis. And so we definitely appreciate having the opportunity to hear about things from an economic perspective and asking us to face some hard realities, but looking at some interesting possibilities for the future as well. So, Dan, thank you once again. Sorry for the technical issues, and I'm sure the conversation will continue.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Thanks a lot, everybody. It was great to be on.